Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Whitey Bulger, the feared boss of Boston's underworld. To some, he was a ruthless figure who ruled the streets with intimidation. To others, he was a local legend who blended power, politics, and silence. Bulger lived in the shadows, always calculating, always one step ahead, building an empire that left a mark on history. Before we begin, like this video, we're aiming for 100 likes in this video. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to keep bringing you more powerful stories. And stay with us because the next story will be even more fascinating, and I know you'll love it. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, close your eyes and imagine the narrow streets of South Boston, the whispers in dimly lit bars, and the quiet rise of a man whose name carried both fear and respect. Settle in, and let the story of Whitey Bulger guide you into the night. James Joseph Bulger Jr. arrived in 1929, the tail end of one roaring decade and the start of a hard era. He grew up in South Boston, in a place where longshoremen rose before dawn, where mothers stretched meals to the end of the week, where church bells rang over brick buildings and tight-knit blocks. His father, once steady with his hands, lost most use of an arm in an industrial accident, and the paycheck that used to cover everything became a thin line barely reaching bills. His mother kept the group together with discipline and faith. Neighbors leaned on each other, shared food, watched kids, and passed along the unwritten rules that defined the area. Stay loyal, protect your own, and do not bring police to your door. He stood out from the start. Pale hair earned him a nickname he came to hate. He told people to call him Jim or Jimmy. The kids learned early how fast talk could get you into trouble, and how quiet could keep you safe. He liked the cinema's low light, the pulse that came with daring stories, and the feeling that schemes could change a life overnight. He tried school, but books never competed with the raw energy of the streets or the pull of older boys who seemed to own the corners. By early teens, he was out late, gravitating toward little rackets that felt bigger than they were. First came scrapes with the law. A petty theft here, a fight there, then a bit more serious trouble. He tested boundaries, pushed them, figured out when to speak and when to shut down. Judges saw him more than teachers did. Each time he walked out, he seemed to absorb a lesson: never write anything down, never say more than you need, and never assume anyone will keep your secrets. Police in Southie learned his face, neighbors learned to look away, and the boy with the stubborn stare learned how much swagger could get with just enough nerve. He wanted a larger stage, and the military offered it. The Air Force gave him travel, routine, and a paycheck. It also gave him rules that rubbed against his grain. He had a quick temper and little patience for authority when pride got challenged. He found himself in disciplinary trouble more than once. Still, he learned from the experience. Structure can be used, not only obeyed. After several years, he returned to Boston with an honorable discharge, a little older, still restless, and with a sharper sense of how systems functioned and how to move inside them. South Boston had changed less than he had. The faces on the corners were familiar, the bars alive with rumor, the bookmakers careful with who they let near their phones. He tried honest work. It didn't hold him. He wanted influence and money, and he wanted both fast. He drifted toward violence-adjacent circles where older men spoke softly, smiled rarely, and made real decisions in the back booths. He watched, listened, learned who handled debts, who controlled numbers, and who collected from the hungry. Ambition pulled him forward. By the mid-1950 seconds, he took a leap that made him a federal case. With a small crew, he began robbing banks. They studied schedules, picked spots with quick exits, and tried to keep the line between intimidation and chaos under control. That line is fragile. Bank robbery carries weighty penalties, and federal agents do not let it go. The spree ended with cuffs, headlines, and a courtroom that did not care where he grew up or why he did it. He pleaded and received a long sentence. Metal doors closed, and the boy from Southie entered a new school where the tuition came in years. Prison-hardened edges already sharp. Atlanta Penitentiary came first, a place filled with every kind of inmate and every kind of scheme. There he volunteered for what he was told were medical trials related to mental health. He believed participation might shave time from his sentence. Instead, he later said he endured mind-bending experiments involving powerful hallucinogens that left him rattled and angry long after the sessions ended. It revealed something else as well. Some institutions will use a person's hope against him. That lesson lodges deep. Transfers took him to Leavenworth, then to Alcatraz when officials decided he needed isolation from old associations. The Rock was strict, gray, controlled by routines that crushed the impatient. He survived. He read, exercised, more careful with his temper, more precise with his plans. He watched how older inmates operated, how they hid their aims behind ordinary habits. He also saw how prison rewarded patience. Outbursts got you nothing but longer time in a smaller room. Silence bought you clarity. In those years, he shaped the exterior that would serve him later, the face that could appear calm while wheels turned behind the eyes. He learned to measure rooms, track who moved near him, and file small details for later use. He understood people responded to confidence wrapped in courtesy. Inmates with a softer presence sometimes had the hardest steel underneath. He cultivated that balance. When word came that he might walk again, he was ready to step back into his city with a better blueprint. Parole came in 1965. He returned to South Boston older, quieter, and with a different kind of reputation. Neighbors remembered the tough kid with quick hands. Now they saw a man who stood apart with a self-possession that read as authority. He said little about the years away. He rented modestly, wore neat clothes, and kept a tight circle. He helped where it paid to help. He bought rounds when the effect was useful. He never forgot a name. Shopkeepers respected him. Some feared him. Many did both at once. He had not become a better citizen. He had become a more deliberate criminal. He chose his friends carefully and slid into the orbit of the Killeen crew, a local group that controlled gambling, loans, and protection on their patch. Donald Killeen, the boss, set the tone. Cautious, thin-skinned about territory, quick to retaliate. Killeen needed soldiers who could enforce boundaries without creating headlines. Jimmy fit the bill. And he knew when to go quiet, when to raise his voice, when to stand behind someone else's threat, and when to carry an order himself. Across the neighborhood, another pack called the Mullen Crew had their own claim to streets and bars. Competition simmered in glances, then heated in parking lots after closing time, then hardened into a feud. In Southie, lines on a map mattered less than lines drawn by pride. A bet taken by one crew could start a chain of insults. A slap in a club could turn into a retaliatory move. Soon, phones rang with warnings, drivers took new routes, and lookouts watched faces a little longer before opening doors. He leaned into this storm with a method prison had refined. He hated loose talk. He avoided recorded lines, favored short walks in loud spaces, and let middlemen deliver messages with just enough ambiguity to keep everyone slightly off balance. He studied patterns, learned which cops could be distracted and which would not be bribed, and tested fences for weak posts. His money grew. So did his influence. He did not need to shout. Power came from timing and information. By 1971 and into 1972, the rivalry escalated. Fists were no longer the only language. Business owners took sides because neutral ground doesn't exist when two crews fight for a neighborhood. People who owed money woke up with unexpected pressure. Men were warned never to set foot in certain rooms. Some disappeared from regular haunts. Rumors spun faster than facts. South Boston residents tried to live their lives through the tension, walking kids to school, getting to shifts, pretending the roar was a distant storm. Everyone knew the names being spoken softly. Everyone knew not to speak them in the wrong company. When Killeen met a fatal end, the balance shifted overnight. It left lieutenants anxious and foot soldiers wondering where to pledge allegiance. Into that vacuum, a bigger outfit from just north of the city known for running a tight ship and smart angles saw a chance to impose a truce that also happened to expand their reach. Jimmy met those men, measured them, and liked what he saw. Practical leaders who valued results, not flash. They respected his discipline. He respected their structure and the doors they could open without drawing heat. The neighborhood was tired of open conflict. A deal settled the feud, not through courts but through an understanding enforced by the very people who had fueled the chaos. The city exhaled a little. Bars refilled. Bookies took wages without a shadow hanging over every slip of paper. Yet the calm had a new architect. Jimmy had moved from a local enforcer to a player with weight. He now stood inside a network that looked beyond corners and thought like a corporation. He began to treat information as currency and loyalty as a contract with penalties. He watched politicians the way he watched rivals, noting who could be charmed and who refused to take calls. He observed police, learned which units focused on which crimes, tracked assignments, and studied how casework actually flowed. He understood that if you could shape what authorities saw, you could shape what they did. He found that the surest armor was a story about you that looked helpful to the right ears. You didn't need to be a saint. You only needed to be useful. On the streets, people now came to him to solve problems, debts to be rescheduled, threats to be toned down, lost cash to be found. He made himself indispensable in the act of controlling outcomes. A business owner who paid his dues had fewer troubles. A street dealer permitted to operate saw his profits taxed. He denounced drugs in public, especially when it played well with neighbors. Privately, he tolerated what he could control and punished what he couldn't. He framed it as order. It was power. Alongside this rise, a second track began, quiet and dangerous in its own way. He had a face from the old neighborhood working in the federal building, a connection born in childhood and grown through mutual convenience. Over coffee and handshakes, a pipeline opened that fed two mouths at once. The same man who collected envelopes in South Boston started passing on names to agents hunting the Italian crews that dominated the rest of the city. The information earned him favor in offices where case files stacked high. It also earned him room to grow. He turned the oldest lesson of the streets into a stark strategy. If the people paid to chase you benefit from your tips, they'll look the other way when you stand on someone else's turf. He walked a thin line and liked the height. He bought property under other people's names, kept cash out of banks, and grew a circle of trusted associates who understood the stakes. He had no tolerance for betrayal and made it known in ways that built a reputation without needing gore. An informant's fate hung over every conversation in his world. Silence became not only a rule, but a survival instinct. People learned to answer questions with shrugs, to say they didn't remember dates, to claim they weren't there. Fear did the work no speech could do. By the mid-1970s, he had transformed himself from the kid who ran errands for older boys into the man who sent other people moving. He had learned from prison how to bide time, from the military how hierarchy functions, and from South Boston how loyalty could be both shield and weapon. He wore neat suits and kept a calm tone. He visited his mother, donated quietly where it bought goodwill, and made sure old neighbors saw him carrying groceries up a flight of stairs. It all served a purpose. Every gesture fit into a larger design. The city around him shifted too. New construction rose. Old rackets adapted to fresh technology. Two-bit hustlers bought pagers. Case agents filed updates on terminals instead of folders. He adapted without fuss. He didn't brag. He collected. He warned. He presented himself as a guardian of the neighborhood and a man who could pick up a phone and make trouble vanish. Behind that image stood cases of undeclared cash, a network of men who owed him favors, and a relationship with law enforcement that turned the traditional war against organized crime into a shadowy trade. No one could have guessed it from the gentle neighbor watering plants years later, but the seed had been planted here, in a boy who refused to be ordinary, in a man who decided that the best way to beat a system was to convince the system it needed him. The streets shaped him, prison honed him, and a hungry city provided the stage. He had now reached a level where choices would ripple far beyond barrooms and back alleys. The calm that followed the neighborhood truce felt almost like a holiday in South Boston. Corner bars went back to sports talk, street corners relaxed, and the old rhythm returned. Paychecks cashed on Fridays, bets placed on Saturdays, mass on Sundays. He used the lull like an engineer uses a blueprint, rearranging his world without announcing a thing. People remembered the fights and the stares from the years before. Now they saw tidy suits, a measured voice, a man who seemed to ease frictions that used to blow up in minutes. He returned favors quickly and remembered birthdays. He listened far more than he spoke. That quiet wasn't kindness. It was calculation. He aligned himself with a partner whose instincts matched his own. Stephen Flemmi, older, composed, hard to read, had a long history in the city's shadows. They weren't a flashy pair. They preferred coffee over champagne and corners over spotlights. Together they built something durable, a network that brought order to rackets that used to flare up every week. They absorbed smaller crews, stabilized bookmaking lines, and decided who could run card games, loans, and after-hours rooms. If you operated in their orbit, you paid. If you stayed out, you kept your peace. Smart people chose the first option. Behind the scenes, another alliance formed that would reshape the city's crime map. An FBI agent from the old neighborhood, John Connolly, had risen in the bureau, with purpose and pride. He knew the Southie Code, the importance of loyalty, and the power of personal history. Another supervisor in the same office, John Morris, believed in a strategy that targeted older, entrenched crime families. The bureau wanted to bring down the Italian organization that had dominated the North End for decades. The agent and the supervisor believed that placing top-tier informants close to that power could win the war. Jimmy, who understood leverage like few others, saw a chance to trade for breathing room. Meetings led to understandings. Understandings became a deal. Files would later show he was registered as a top echelon source. He hated the label and would reject it for the rest of his life, insisting he bought protection rather than traded information. Either way, the effect looked the same on the street. He supplied tips about the rival organization's habits, meetings, and moves. In return, he received warnings when pressure shifted toward him, and sometimes he heard who was talking to whom. If a wiretap went up or a task force focused on one of his hangouts, he learned about it through a whisper, a coffee, a friendly caution. That edge protected his growing business and fed the FBI's massive cases against the North End leadership. He parlayed the calm into quietly expanding control. Bookmakers who had survived for years without picking a side found that neutrality no longer worked. They could pay steady tribute and get assured protection from thefts and bad debts, or they could face trouble they couldn't predict. Most paid. The cut he collected didn't make him greedy. He preferred steady money to risky windfalls. He liked predictable revenue and loyal intermediaries. He trained lieutenants to keep clean books in their heads and to write down as little as possible. He rotated meeting spots, changed cars often, and left his home without predictable routine. Police who watched him saw order, not chaos. That was by design. He made a show of hating narcotics and told anyone who would listen that drugs were poison. In public, he spoke like a protector, claiming he wanted kids safe and streets quiet. Testimony later established that his crew still taxed traffickers and allowed certain operations to function in the background under his watch. What mattered most to him wasn't the product, it was control. Any business that generated cash in his neighborhood came with a price. If he felt a dealer's behavior brought heat or danger, he shut it down. If profit was steady and quiet, he took his cut. That dual posture public defender, private collector kept neighbors conflicted and rivals wary. He learned to move money in ways that hid its origin. Cash sat in safes and safety deposit boxes under other names. Property deals ran through friends and family members of friends. He bought into small buildings, not towers, and preferred the comfort of three-deckers to glass condos. He never flashed. He let others flash and watched who took notice. He favored old cars that didn't stand out and studied his mirrors the way other people studied newspapers. He used paper maps long after everyone else trusted memory. He trained himself to assume the worst and act like the best. In 1979, federal prosecutors disrupted the old arrangement that had put a different figure at the top. The previous head of the Winter Hill Group, Howie Winter, and others were indicted in a race-fixing scheme that touched tracks across state lines. The case knocked leadership sideways. Into that gap stepped the pair with the calm faces and the careful habits. Without fanfare, Jimmy and Flemmy became the center of gravity. They kept the organization running like a business. Reliable collections, clear rules, firm penalties? No. Shouting in dining rooms. No fights that spilled onto sidewalks. No public scenes for reporters to turn into Sunday columns. Quiet became strategy. He cultivated a small circle with defined roles. A trusted younger lieutenant, Kevin Weeks, handled collections, watched doors, and kept eyes on people who might talk too much. Another associate, John Martirano, was known for stepping in when rivals pushed too far. He would later cooperate with prosecutors and describe how the group addressed perceived threats. The crew was small by design. Fewer mouths meant fewer leaks. They knew who to trust and who to avoid, who led with fear and who led with respect, which judges were fair and which officers couldn't be swayed. The deal with the Bureau paid off in a spectacular way that had nothing to do with him directly and everything to do with his future. In 1981, agents bugged the North End headquarters of the Italian leadership. The tapes caught men in charge talking openly about control and discipline. That evidence led to convictions that dismantled a decades-old structure. While others celebrated at headquarters, he saw opportunity spread across the city. He moved into revenue streams that had belonged to people now facing prison. The FBI, satisfied with its victory, remained slow to turn its full attention to the South Boston crew. He had helped give them their big case. They hadn't yet decided to make him theirs. The Florida connection brought both profit and danger. The crew reached into World Jai Alai, a gambling enterprise with cash, prestige, and attention. When a wealthy owner in Tulsa, Roger Wheeler, began to suspect theft and started asking hard questions in 1981, he became a target. Prosecutors later connected the Boston group to his killing. That murder created pressure across states and agencies. Investigators with no ties to Boston politics or loyalties began looking at the Winter Hill crew as more than local players. Jimmy understood the stakes. He tightened his circle, cut small risks, and leaned harder on his FBI sources for warnings about where heat might land next. The next year, panic inside their world turned lethal in Boston. Brian Halloran, once part of the orbit, approached authorities and began to describe crimes connected to the crew, including what he knew about the Florida case. A tip raced back through channels never meant to be used that way. Halloran and a man giving him a ride home, Michael Donahue, were murdered on a South Boston street in 1982. The killing shook the city. An innocent man had died. The outrage changed minds in offices that had treated the Southie crew like a useful tool in a larger mission. Families demanded answers. Detectives outside the Bureau pushed harder. The balance began to tilt. Through it all, he kept his posture. He didn't rant. He didn't gloat. He denied being an informant, always. He insisted he paid for protection like businessmen paid for consultants. He framed himself as a neighborhood loyalist, someone who kept the peace by enforcing rules that others couldn't enforce. The tension between image and reality grew with each headline. Court records in later years traced envelopes, dinners, and favors that traveled from the crew to their federal guardians. One supervisor admitted accepting cash and gifts, a confession that would stain everything the office had done in that era. The fallout took years to play out. In the moment, the machine kept turning. During the mid-1980 seconds, he diversified. He invested in small businesses and real estate while continuing the street operations. He kept layers between himself and any individual enterprise. If you grabbed one of his people, you still had to link that person back to him. He fostered loyalty with a strict rule. Anyone who faced a case could expect help with legal bills. If they kept faith. If they broke faith, there would be a cost. The rule was clear and terrifying, without needing to be spoken aloud. In that world, silence wasn't just a virtue, it was a survival plan. His personal life drew a boundary he rarely let people cross. He had long relationships that mattered to him, Teresa Stanley for years, then Catherine Gregg, but he kept their world separate from the business as much as possible. He was a creature of habit in small ways. He ate at the same spots, trusted the same barbers, visited his mother, and wrote almost nothing down. Friends from childhood saw him as Jimmy, a man who never forgot a favor or a slight, and who could show warmth when it cost him nothing. Even people who feared him would tell you he could be gracious, almost courtly, if he chose. The switch from charm to cold distance could happen in a blink. He never treated the IRA matter like theater. He approached it as logistics. In 1984, an attempt to ship weapons from New England to Irish militants unraveled after one participant began working with federal agents. The shipment was seized on the high seas. According to later testimony, the crew believed they had been betrayed, and prosecutors later persuaded a jury that Jimmy participated in the killing of the suspected informant, John McIntyre. That case, combined with others, would become part of the racketeering charges that finally reached him decades later. Back then, in the moment, the failed shipment affirmed his belief that the only real safety in his world was control. He tightened security again and narrowed the list of people who could get close. He took precautions that detectives later recognized in case files filled with missed chances. He wore gloves, not bravado. He checked under cars, used scanners to hear police chatter, and ran routes that let him spot tails. If he suspected surveillance on a meeting place, he simply didn't show up. He avoided phones, or spoke in riddles broken by names and dates said out of order. He distrusted paper more than he distrusted enemies. He practiced vanishing in plain sight, blending into lunch crowds, holding doors, nodding hello to people who never realized who he was. By the late 1980s, pressure intensified. The spotlight that had once been fixed on the North End moved south. State police, city detectives, and federal prosecutors outside the compromised circle built cases with patience. They charted who collected from whom, who talked to whom, which cars appeared outside which houses, which numbers were dialed and when. An earlier operation to bug a garage used by his crew had already failed after the target site went quiet. A failure investigators suspected was caused by a leak. That failure made the next generation of pursuit more careful, more secretive, and less ready to share with anyone who might unwittingly alert the wrong ear. He watched friends age into respectability and others disappear into long sentences. He also watched a new crop of younger men, louder and less disciplined, step into the business across the city. He disliked noise, the kind that attracts cameras and lawsuits. He believed in control built on patience, intimidation expressed in quiet reminders, not tantrums. He had reached middle age with a bank of cash, a sharp mind, and a strange kind of standing in South Boston. A feared broker of disputes, an enemy of anyone who challenged his order, a neighbor who might shovel a sidewalk without being asked. Nothing lasts forever. Even he knew that. He could sense the city changing around him. Boston boomed in places that had been empty lots. New people moved in with new expectations about safety and policing. Editors hired investigative reporters to chase leads that used to die on the vine. Prosecutors younger than the era's scandals came into leadership roles with no patience for old arrangements. The Bureau, embarrassed by revelations about its relationships with informants, began to see the cost of that strategy in a hard light. The same connection that had given him cover began to rot. It would not be long before the quiet nods on stairwells turned into subpoenas and arrests. He responded as he always had. By preparing, he put aside more cash. He changed some habits and hardened others. He thought about doors that could be used when the front door finally showed a badge on the other side. He kept his world calm, even as pressure built beyond view. He did not boast about the past. He focused on survival in the present. The neighborhood still saw the tidy suits and the controlled voice. The networks still sent envelopes, and debts still got settled one way or another. But the people closest to him felt it an edge, a sharpened caution, a sense that even someone as careful as he was had started to run out of safe corners. What set him apart, then and always, was not luck. It was an ability to exploit every system, neighborhood code, criminal hierarchy, law enforcement priorities, without giving himself away. He used reputation when it helped, and deniability when it mattered. He told one truth to the right office, and another truth to the right bar. He understood something most people never consider. Fear can be quiet. It can sound like a favor. It can look like a handshake. It can feel like a kindness that you dare not refuse. He wrapped that fear in routine and carried it forward, as if it were just another part of daily life. In that decade, he had everything he thought he wanted. Money hidden where no ledger could see it, a crew that obeyed without question, and access to information from places that should have been off limits. Yet he also had something else, a long list of enemies, a trail of victims whose families wanted justice, and a growing number of detectives and prosecutors who no longer believed the ends justified the means. The city had tolerated him because he seemed to keep the peace while bigger fish were fried. Now the city had fewer bigger fish to chase. That meant only one course remained. Pressure that had once felt far off started to press in from all sides. The city had changed. So had the investigators. Younger prosecutors with little patience for old arrangements moved into key roles. State police and federal teams outside the tainted circle built cases the slow way, by charting who paid whom, who met where, What cars showed up on certain streets at regular hours, which beepers lit up at specific times, which bank boxes were visited right after collections. A few former allies slipped into interview rooms and began to talk, not just about petty debts and neighborhood pushes, but about the entire system that kept fear humming quietly along the waterfront and across the hills. The people hunting him were learning to avoid the leaks that had saved him. Files were kept tighter. Task forces were smaller. A sealed plan took shape. He didn't panic. Panic never served him. He stayed with routines, kept meals simple, kept hours odd, spent extra time on walks that allowed him to check for tails, looked up at windows with curtains pulled to see if the same silhouette appeared twice in a week. He stepped lighter in places he used to treat like extensions of his own living room. He talked less in cars. He moved meetings to places with crowds and noise. So steady, it turned words into murmur. He felt the pressure but refused to show it. South Boston still saw a neighbor with neat hair and a tidy coat who opened doors and nodded to older folks on the sidewalk. Rico gave prosecutors a blade designed for the kind of network he had built. They didn't need to prove every single act by his own hands. They needed to show a pattern, a structure, a set of crimes that were not random but business. Loans with hard edges, illegal gambling with controlled odds, extortion dressed as protection, kickbacks, hush payments, the disciplining of associates who looked toward a different future. On top of that came the darkest charges. Killings tied to turf, to betrayal, to profits too large to risk. Some names had already echoed through the city for years. Brian Halloran, Michael Donahue, Roger Wheeler, John Callahan, each one pulling new agencies into the hunt. Others, less known outside certain circles, weighed just as heavily on the people who loved them. The file grew. Every system he had exploited began to reveal its cracks. The cooperative relationship that had shielded his crew turned from armor into evidence. In back hallways and sworn statements, the extent of favors and warnings started to surface. A supervisor admitted to gifts. An agent's proximity to the crew no longer looked like tactical brilliance, it looked like corruption. A judge would later document in chilling detail how casework in Boston had been bent away from him for years. None of that happened overnight, but the trend was set. He could read trends. He didn't loosen his rules. He tightened them. Fewer intermediaries, fewer surprises. Cash truly became king. Friends were reminded, gently at first, and then more firmly, to stop running their mouths. Paper was poison. New people were ignored. He tried to live in the margins of his own life, erasing footprints as soon as he saw them. He moved cash in bundles that could cross a state line, in a single duffel. He set aside a reserve big enough to fund a sudden exit. He rehearsed in his mind which door would be used if a late-night knock came with a certain tone. He had thought about disappearing before. Now he considered it necessary. His personal life adapted to the mood. He kept visits short, phone calls shorter. A long relationship frayed under the strain. He could be kind in small ways that cost nothing: a ride, a check, a holiday envelope, but kept a cold compartment no one could enter. The distance that made him effective in business isolated him in private. Friends sensed the shift in his voice when certain topics approached. He could still tell a joke in a bar or talk baseball like a man with nothing on his mind. Then a phrase would arrive that made everyone remember who they were sitting with. By 1994, the storm he had avoided for so long lined up on the horizon. A grand jury listened. Investigators compared maps and times, checked old tips against fresh testimony, and stitched together a case that would name him in a way no previous effort had. The plan stayed sealed, but rumors traveled the way they always do. He learned enough to know the risk had changed from acceptable to final. A warning made its way to him later. It would be alleged that the source was the very office meant to surprise him, and he did what he had always promised. Himself he would do when the moment arrived. He left. Departure looked like errands. No suitcases on the stoop, no dramatic hugs. A quiet exit through a back route, an exchange of cars, a roll of cash moved from one hiding place to another. He took Teresa Stanley with him, the longtime companion who had put up with absences and secrets for years, and set out on a road trip that had no postcard joy in it. They drove under highway lamps, stopped at motels with numbers instead of names, and paid for everything in cash. New York's traffic swallowed them without a ripple. The South turned them into just two more travelers. New Orleans offered a brief lane to disappear into crowds. Out west, they watched the horizon flatten into a line they could follow, as long as fuel and nerves held steady. Travel gave him a familiarity with anonymity he hadn't felt in decades. No one in a gas station in a small town knew his name or cared. That freedom felt like oxygen. It also felt like a test. He was someone who controlled space by understanding every face in it. Now every face was new. They moved carefully, avoiding routines, doubling back if a clerk seemed too curious, picking hiding spots that would look like ordinary life from the street. In quiet rooms with the blinds closed, he thought about his mother's kitchen, his old bars, and the corners of a neighborhood that once felt like a private office. A life can be large and still narrow. He knew that better than anyone. The strain of life on the run weighed heavily on Stanley. She missed children, grandchildren, normal days where you could use your true name. He understood. He couldn't offer both safety and the past. He took her back to Boston quietly so she could reclaim her life, then made a different choice about his own. He returned to a safe house, linked up with Catherine Gregg, the woman who had been in his life for years, and slipped away again. Gregg accepted the risk and the rules. She knew the drill. Cash only, no slips. An identity that could pass a glance but not a deep look. She cared for him, and he for her. That closeness would be the only comfort either of them would allow. Out on the road a second time, the pair practiced a ritual of invisibility. They cultivated middle-of-the-pack postures, friendly enough to get by, forgettable enough to be safe. They settled briefly in places where a 60-something couple wouldn't raise eyebrows. Coastal towns with year-round tenants. Cities where renters came and went without a neighbor learning more than a first name. He let himself appear as a man who liked morning walks and evening news, who carried groceries and minded his own business. She groomed their cover with small, normal habits. Pet care, pharmacy runs, polite chats with building managers. They avoided anyone who asked even slightly intrusive questions. Back in Boston, the reckoning he had tried to outrun finally erupted in courtrooms. Arrests hit his remaining circle. Flemmy landed in custody. A younger lieutenant who had once seemed implacably loyal would eventually cooperate, taking agents to burial sites and describing a world that most people had only guessed at. The public learned words that had circulated in whispers for years. Executives tied to the Florida gambling case faced juries. A Boston judge, Mark Wolf, held painstaking hearings that laid out the mechanics of how federal guardians had turned into unreliable partners. A long opinion documented how the office had protected sources who were supposed to be controlled, not indulged. The scandal stained badges and reshaped the conversation about informants for a generation. Names of victims re-entered the news with solemn weight. Families heard, in careful courtroom phrasing, how loved ones had been targeted or lured or cut off when their usefulness ended. Details stayed within the bounds of decency, but the picture was devastating. Prosecutors would later present evidence that tied him to multiple killings across 2 decades, including the murder of a Florida businessman asking hard questions about Jai-Alai profits, the death of a Boston man who had approached authorities, along with an innocent friend who offered him a ride, the execution of a former executive in Miami, the disappearance of a woman connected to his closest ally, the killing of a suspected informant after a failed weapons shipment, the death of an old-school bank robber lured by false promises. Those and other acts formed the core of the racketeering narrative that would define his legacy in court. His brother, Billy, a towering figure in state politics, tried to live in a separate world, insisting on formal distance while never disowning the family bond. That tension became a public debate in its own right. When investigators asked, Billy acknowledged occasional calls from his fugitive sibling, but said little more. A posture that triggered controversy and eventually cost him a prestigious university job. The spectacle of a family straddling 2 very different versions of power, one lawful, one criminal, left the city split between loyalty and outrage. On the run, he adjusted to a routine that could have belonged to any retiree, calibrated to one difference. He never forgot that a single slip could end it. He kept a low profile and saved his temper for the rare moments it might keep him safe. He read, walked, watched, and counted faces. He avoided drinking in the way people do when caution outranks appetite. He didn't chase thrills. He chased a version of peace defined by anonymity. The criminal network he had once micromanaged now existed only as a memory and a cautionary tale. Survival replaced expansion as the day's goal. He also kept faith with old habits that served him. He distrusted banks even more than he had before. He maintained a cache that would allow him to move at a day's notice. He kept items that could be traded in an emergency. Gold, loose jewelry, unremarkable watches that still held value. He paid attention to bulletin boards in buildings and grocery stores, the way fugitives do when they're trying to read whether a landlord likes to snoop or a neighbor works strange hours. He tested people around him with small asks to learn how nosy they were, then either turned up the warmth or turned himself into a shadow. Law enforcement didn't stop. The case files didn't gather dust. The Bureau offered a large reward and, years later, put his face on the top 10 list, a classification reserved for people who move the public to call faster. Some campaigns focused on him, others on Greg, whose attention to dental care and grooming later offered a clever angle. Public service announcements, aimed at salon and dentistry professionals who might recall a particular patient. Those efforts would pay off far in the future. In the mid-1990 seconds, the manhunt still felt like a national chess game. Agents moved, the fugitive countered, and the board stayed crowded. Stories accumulated in South Boston like fog. People claimed to have seen him in Irish villages, at desert diners, in casinos, at old ballparks. Most tales fell apart upon inspection. A few had enough truth to keep hope alive for surveillance teams. They never found him where he had just been. He stayed half a step ahead, using the same instincts that had kept him alive in a different way back home. Don't brag. Don't linger. Don't trust anyone eager to get too close. Too fast. When he slipped, it was small, an extra glance at a passing cruiser, a late rent payment corrected in cash within an hour, a visible irritation quickly smoothed into a smile. While he lived as the pleasant neighbor, the cases tied to his past marched forward. His closest circle changed shape as pressure broke bonds. A one-time friend admitted roles in serious crimes and led agents to graves hidden for years. Another former associate wrote letters and then a memoir. Journalists compiled timelines, reviewed trial transcripts, and told the public how a city's law enforcement strategy had created the perfect loophole for a ruthless operator. Each revelation replaced neighborhood myth with documented reality. It turned out the quieter the streets had seemed in the 1,980 seconds, the more elaborate the machinery was that kept them quiet. The long arc of his rise and sudden flight revealed something stark about power built on fear. Once fear loses its sponsor, people find their voices. Bartenders talked. Bookmakers described ledgers that never fully existed. Relatives of victims spoke with a grief that carried a moral clarity hard to wash away. The city's romance with its own legends dimmed. It is one thing to nod at a tough guy who keeps the noisy kids in line. It is another to listen to families recount birthdays missed forever, tables with permanent empty chairs, and years of silence imposed by a threat you can feel even when you can't see its owner. For him, that silence had always been a tool. Now it became isolation. He trusted only Greg, who shared the risk and the routine with unflinching loyalty. She walked dogs, tended plants, chose markets, and made their life look ordinary. He fixed small things in their apartments, carried shopping bags, and kept his voice even with landlords. He had opinions about sports and weather, and never about politics, religion, or crime. That restraint, which once felt like swagger, now felt like necessity. The man who once moved entire neighborhoods with a glance had become a man who measured success in days without a knock at the door. He had transformed himself from figurehead to ghost. Yet the past didn't loosen. Old acts don't dissolve just because a mailbox bears a different name. Agents tracked financial crumbs. Prosecutors secured charges that would wait for him as long as it took. Reporters kept files open and sources warm. A generation grew up hearing two versions of his name: the outlaw who outlasted everyone, and the criminal whose crimes demanded an accounting. He understood that an accounting would come, one way or another. He had dodged trouble for decades by turning enemies into assets and assets into insurance. That strategy had run out of road. Now his skills narrowed to a single craft: staying hidden. It was a craft he practiced with discipline, no sudden purchases, no risky trips, no old friends, No holiday calls, but a craft is still only a delay. The story waiting for him did not go away. It sat in court calendars, sealed motions, and shoeboxes full of clippings kept by families who would not forget. Sunset on the West Coast looks different than sunset over Dorchester Bay, but it carries the same message. Light fades, and you prepare for the hours when shadows do their work. He had spent a lifetime working in shadows. The difference now was simple. He wasn't the one directing the action anymore. He was hiding from it. Years rolled by with a strange rhythm. Court filings and news segments back east, quiet mornings and rented rooms out west. He had slipped out of Boston just ahead of a major indictment and turned himself into a ghost with steady habits and forgettable manners. He didn't chase thrills or drift into scenes that might tempt a boast. He moved in ways that looked ordinary to anyone who didn't know the name that had been on front pages for decades. He held doors, nodded to neighbors, paid rent in cash, and walked in the early light like a man enjoying retirement. Beneath that calm, every step was deliberate. The country that once felt small to a street kid from South Boston suddenly felt immense. He learned how to vanish into apartment buildings with dozens of units and no doorman, how to rent where turnover was normal, how to balance friendliness with limits that kept questions away. He and Catherine used aliases, picked up mail under false names, and changed routines whenever familiarity crept in. If a landlord grew curious, they were gone. If a neighbor lingered in a hallway with too much energy, they found a new place. He stuck to cash, avoided banks, and never allowed a written record when a handshake and a smile would do. Back in Boston, the unraveling of the old protection system moved from rumor to record. Courtrooms heard testimony that had once been traded in whispers. Agents who had built careers on high-profile cases admitted to gifts and favors that never should have passed hands. A federal judge held detailed hearings that documented how informant handling had been bent until it broke. The public learned how one office's strategy of cultivating sources inside criminal organizations had, in this case, shielded the very crimes it was supposed to stop. Those findings reshaped policy across the justice system and forced the Bureau to rewrite the rules governing confidential sources. As institutional reform inched forward, the human stories came into focus. Former associates flipped and described how money moved, how decisions were made, how people were pressured into silence, how fears were nurtured without needing loud threats. One name after another returned to the news, attached now to fuller accounts. Families heard careful, sober descriptions of loved ones lost in schemes that had stretched from neighborhood corners to boardrooms and racetracks. Investigators exhumed remains at hidden sites. A younger lieutenant guided agents to burial grounds he had visited years earlier for a different purpose. The past was being organized into cases, one file at a time. While he hid, an agent once seen as a neighborhood success story stood trial. John Connolly, the childhood acquaintance turned federal investigator, faced charges that peeled back the layers of a partnership that should never have been permitted. In 2002, a jury convicted him on racketeering-related counts and obstruction, a verdict that sent him to prison and cemented the sense that a whole era of law enforcement in Boston had lost its way. Later, Astate Case, in Florida, brought a separate conviction tied to the murder of a Miami executive connected to the Jai Alai dealings. That proceeding added years to his sentence before later appeals reshaped parts of the outcome. The point had been made. A badge carries obligations that cannot be traded for results. The manhunt for the fugitive took on its own life. His name appeared on the list reserved for people whose capture becomes a national priority. The reward climbed, encouraging anyone with a memory or a hunch to pick up a phone. Television shows that specialized in wanted posters turned him into a serialized character whose storyline stretched through seasons. Public service announcements focused on the woman at his side, noting her interest in dental care and grooming, hoping that professionals in those fields would recognize a routine client who paid in cash and used fake names. Agents knew he distrusted attention. They aimed at the quieter half of the pair and waited for a break. He met the pressure with discipline that looked almost dull. He changed haircuts and clothing styles as he aged, sticking to simple jackets and plain pants. He avoided anything that screamed new money or old legend. He watched the street the way he always had, scanning for the offbeat note an idling car with no reason to be there, a person studying a door they didn't intend to enter, a second glance that lingered too long. He kept a reserve of cash and items that could be sold anywhere. No paperwork needed. He favored small repairs on his own over service calls. quiet walks over crowded venues, and magazines nobody watched you buy. Santa Monica gave him something he hadn't expected, a feeling of being ordinary, a renter among renters, a face among faces. He and Catherine settled into an older building blocks from the ocean, the kind of place that held teachers, retirees, waiters, and out-of-towners in equal measure. They were Charles and Carol, a polite pair who minded their business. He fed cats behind the building and chatted about ball games without revealing a thing about who he had been. She handled errands with a steadiness that blended into daily life, pharmacy visits, salon appointments, small talk with neighbors who learned no more than first names. The cover worked because it didn't look like a cover. Yet back east, the legal net tightened. Prosecutors expanded indictments to include a long list of acts: extortion, illegal gambling, usury, money laundering, obstruction, and a series of murders that spanned decades and states. Associates who chose cooperation over loyalty described specific episodes. A business owner told jurors how a cherished South Boston liquor store changed hands under pressure, a local monopoly taken not with contracts but with fear. Former partners recounted payouts demanded from bookmakers, drug traffickers, and nightclub owners regular envelopes that secured permission to operate without sudden trouble. Longtime friends who had watched him work both sides of the street, exploiting his status as a source, now explained it in a witness chair and under oath. Even in hiding, he stayed who he had always been. He read voraciously, saved clippings, followed Boston stories from a distance. He maintained a strict boundary between conversation and confession. He never denied past acts to the person he shared a kitchen with, but he didn't wallow either. He lived in the immediate what door to use, what time to shop, what repair to make next. He believed routine, carefully curated, could be as protective as a team of bodyguards. That belief kept him free for a very long time. The break came from the strategy built around her, not him. After years of chasing sightings that faded on contact, agents launched a targeted media push about Catherine's habits. They placed discreet announcements where they thought they would be noticed by the right eyes and ears: daytime programming, magazines, online boards frequented by people who could spot a particular pattern of visits and products. The idea was simple. A fugitive might hide in shadows, but everyday services leave impressions. A tip arrived from someone who recognized the woman in those notices. It pointed to a quiet apartment in a coastal city where no one had thought to look lately. Agents set up surveillance, confirmed movements, and built a plan that reduced risk. When they approached, they used a ruse to draw him out of the unit and into a spot where a safe, quick arrest was possible. He didn't fight. The man who had spent a career avoiding the loudest sorts of scenes surrendered in a moment without theater. Catherine was detained as well. Neighbors, drawn to the commotion, learned in an instant that the soft-spoken tenant who doted on pets and carried groceries had been one of the most wanted people in the country. The search that followed revealed the tools of a long flight: stacks of cash tucked away with care, multiple identifications under various names, and firearms that he had kept close as insurance. Investigators documented everything, added it to years of existing evidence, and shipped him back east to face charges that had been waiting for nearly 2 decades. The national chase was over. The courtroom chapters were about to begin. His first appearances were tight and formal. He listened, answered briefly, and entered not guilty pleas. He rejected the label informant the way he always had, insisting that any interaction with agents had been a transaction for protection, not cooperation. Judges set schedules. Lawyers filed motions. The families of victims watched from benches, sometimes clasping hands, sometimes sitting rigidly upright, carrying photographs in their minds that meant more than any exhibit label ever could. The arrest also closed the circle around people who had helped him during those years. Catherine faced federal charges for harboring a fugitive, conspiracy, and identity fraud. She admitted guilt and received a sentence that reflected years of aiding his evasion. Later, when she declined to testify before a grand jury about possible helpers, she accepted additional time for contempt. She paid her own price: years in custody, a permanent record, the end of anonymity. Yet those who knew her in those Santa Monica days remembered kindness, routine, and loyalty, a mix that had made their cover life possible for so long. Outside the courtroom, civil cases moved in parallel. Families of victims sued the government, arguing that official misconduct had allowed crimes to occur or remain unsolved. Some actions produced significant judgments, acknowledgments by courts that a duty had been breached. The settlements could never match the loss, but they marked a turning point in how institutions talked about responsibility. The old ends justify the means posture had collapsed under the weight of actual outcomes. For the public, the arrest answered one question and raised many others. How had he managed to stay hidden in plain sight? How deep had the corruption gone? How do you reconcile a neighborhood's complicated memory, a man who could appear helpful in some moments with the weight of the crimes laid out in filings? Reporters produced long series re-examining every stage of his rise, from childhood mischief to prison yard lessons, to the quiet alliances that turned him into a man too valuable to chase for too many years. Books collected interviews, trials were live blogged, documentaries updated decades-old footage with fresh interviews from detectives who had finally seen their cases ripen into verdicts. Inside holding cells, he aged. The careful routines of the fugitive life gave way to institutional schedules. He wrote letters, read news, and prepared for the fight he had always assumed he would face if he lived long enough to be caught. He believed the rules had been bent against him, not for him, and signaled early that he intended to challenge evidence, question motives, and call out the government's compromises. He would keep that posture to the end. His capture closed one era and opened another. The next phase would test narratives, pit memories against records, and force a city to face a story it had told itself for years. The story of a hard man who kept order, now reframed by ledgers, wiretaps, testimony, and the steady march of cases that reached across time. The courtroom would not tell bedtime myths. It would catalog actions and consequences, however uncomfortable that felt to people who had once praised the quiet in a neighborhood that had paid a heavy hidden price for it. He had lived on the run by practicing modesty, by hiding grand ambition inside small, careful moves. That skill had served him. It could not carry him any farther. With shackles replacing rental keys and a docket replacing a road atlas, he faced the sum of a life built on leverage, fear, and calculation. The jurors who would eventually sit in judgment did not know the smell of those South Boston bars or the sound of the old harbor at night. They would know exhibits, testimony, and instructions. The myth would give way to evidence. The man who had spent a lifetime controlling narratives would find himself in the one place where he had none. Court moved at its own pace, not at the speed of headlines. After marshals flew him back to Boston, he settled into a routine defined by counts, call-outs, and concrete. Lawyers visited with binders and strategies. He listened, calm enough to unsettle people who expected a different mood. The plan was familiar. Fight on every viable ground, question the government's choices, and refuse the informant label that had trailed him for decades. He framed his dealings with agents as self-preservation, not cooperation. That distinction mattered to him more than most things. Pre-trial battles set the boundaries. His attorneys argued that a senior federal prosecutor from years past had granted him immunity for offenses committed while he supplied tips against other groups. The claim leaned on the era's blurred ethics, on meetings never recorded the way they should have been, and on a culture that had treated results as a shield. The judge, careful and methodical, ruled that no lawful promise could have covered violent crimes, that no agreement, if it existed, could stretch that far. The jury would not hear an immunity claim as a defense. That decision defined the path ahead. Other motions tried to exclude evidence tied to old informant files, and to pressure the government to reveal every leak and every instance of favoritism. The court allowed some disclosures and denied others. Everyone in the room knew the backdrop. A federal office that had for years prized access over caution and had then imploded under the weight of its own compromises. He wanted that history front and center. Prosecutors wanted the spotlight on acts, not excuses. Jury selection began. The panel that took their seats in 2013 came from across eastern Massachusetts. Office workers, retirees, tradespeople, parents. They carried no myth from old neighborhood corners, only the instructions they were given and the oath they had taken. They would hear a portrait of a criminal enterprise that spanned decades. The government's case aimed to show a structure, a crew that collected from bookmakers and loan customers, taxed drug operations while denouncing them in public, steered business takeovers through fear, and enforced order with acts that left families grieving. The charges reached back to the 1,970 seconds and ran up to the years before his flight. Witnesses stepped forward who once would never have considered it. A longtime associate, John Martirano, admitted to a career of violence in exchange for a deal that reduced his time behind bars. He sketched out the logic of how disputes ended in that world, and described meetings where decisions were made. Another key figure, Stephen Flemmi, his closest partner for years, testified about the overlap between street power and law enforcement access, about how information moved in both directions. Younger lieutenants, including Kevin Weeks, provided details about collections, hidden burials, and the procedures that kept day-to-day operations quiet. Their credibility became the battleground. The defense pointed to their plea deals, to years spent avoiding accountability, to motives that could color any memory. Families sat through it all, faces set, some clutching tissues, others staring straight ahead. They heard the names of loved ones read into the record and listened to careful descriptions that avoided sensationalism but conveyed the weight of loss. A businessman from Oklahoma, Roger Wheeler, had been targeted after asking questions about money missing from a gambling company he owned. A former executive, John Callahan, died in Miami when investigators believed he could become a problem for those who feared exposure. A Boston man, Brian Halloran, who had approached authorities, was killed along with Michael Donahue, a friend who gave him a ride home that night. A suspected informant, John McIntyre, vanished after a failed plot to ship arms overseas. A jeweler, Arthur Bucky Barrett, never came back after a meeting tied to money. Two young women close to the crew, Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey, became part of the story in ways no one who loved them could accept. Prosecutors framed those acts as pieces of a single enterprise. The defense pushed back against each one, arguing about who made which choice, and whether witnesses remembered what they claimed to recall. The courtroom felt less like theater than like excavation. Ledgers weren't always paper. Sometimes they lived in heads. Conversations happened in cars and on walks. Records existed in fragments. A safe deposit box log here, a property deed there, bank slips that didn't match paychecks. The government used all of it to build a pattern. Extortion wasn't a scene in a movie. It was a sequence: visits, warnings, a change in ownership filed neatly at City Hall. A South Boston liquor store deal became a symbol of how consent can be forced without a shouted threat. The owner, who said he had been coerced, died unexpectedly before he could testify. Authorities later prosecuted another man for that death, and it wasn't tied to the defendant. Even without that witness, the larger portrait held. He kept his posture. Jacket neat, hair trimmed, eyes steady. He bristled at times, especially when the label informant came up, or when Flemmi described acts he called lies. He muttered, argued briefly with the judge, and at one point reacted so sharply that spectators felt the history in the room press forward like a sudden wind. He still would not paint himself as a helper of the government. That was a line he refused to cross. Defense counsel did what they could with the material they had. They carved at deals made with witnesses who hoped to shave years off their sentences. They argued that prosecutors had built a house on compromised foundations, relying on men who had done grave harm and now sought redemption at someone else's expense. They highlighted the misconduct that had already shaken the local FBI office, insisting that if the government had bent rules once, jurors should question what it presented now. They pressed the point that he had fled because he was warned proof, in their telling, not of guilt, but of a corrupt system still trying to cover itself. But juries are asked to separate institutional failure from individual acts. After weeks of testimony and careful legal instructions, the panel returned a verdict that echoed through the city. They found him guilty of racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and firearms crimes. On the murder counts embedded in the racketeering case, they concluded he had participated in 11 killings and found insufficient proof on others. The mixed nature of those findings reflected the complexities of decades-old crimes and the limits of memory. The broader message was clear. The enterprise had existed, and he had led it. Sentencing turned the courtroom into a place of reckoning. One by one, relatives addressed him and the judge. They spoke of birthdays that never arrived, chairs that stayed empty at holidays, and the fatigue of carrying grief while silence was enforced by fear. Their words were steady and restrained. When it was his turn, he did not apologize. He called the process unfair and returned to the theme that his relationship with the government had been twisted into something it had never been. The judge imposed 2 life sentences plus additional time, ordered tens of millions in forfeitures and restitution, and brought the criminal case to its formal end. The years of leverage and calculated distance had been replaced by a number no one walks away from. Appeals followed, as they always do in cases of this magnitude. His lawyers pressed the immunity claim again, challenged rulings that had limited their presentation, and argued that the government's corruption had so infected the case that a fair trial was impossible. The appeals court reviewed the record and affirmed the verdict, holding that even if old relationships had been mishandled, the evidence of the enterprise and of his role in it did not depend on excused misconduct. The Supreme Court declined to intervene. The trial's outcome stood. Catherine Gregg faced her own path through the system. She pleaded guilty to harboring a fugitive and identity fraud and received a substantial sentence that reflected years spent helping him avoid arrest. Later, when a grand jury sought her testimony about potential helpers, she refused and accepted additional time for contempt. People who knew her in Santa Monica remembered routine and kindness. The record now showed loyalty that cost her years. Outside, the culture digested what it had learned. Books pulled together the threads how a neighborhood code, an ambitious crew, and a federal strategy had combined to create a void where accountability should have been. Reporters tested every myth against documents and witness lists. A Hollywood film retold earlier chapters with big stars and stark lighting. The city debated how to remember an era when quiet streets came at a hidden price. Some residents insisted the calm had protected families. Others replied that plenty of families had paid in silence for that calm and deserved better long before the arrests. Prison life, for him, meant swapping chosen routines for institutional ones. He went from a carefully managed, low-profile existence in California to a schedule posted on a bulletin board. He received medical care on timetables he didn't control. He read newspapers that brought Boston to him in ink and small type. He wrote letters, sometimes to people he had known for years, sometimes to strangers who had reached out of curiosity. He warned young correspondents not to romanticize crime, stressing that the trade ends nearly always one way behind bars or worse. The tone was blunt, free of glamour. He still denied that he had ever been anyone's source. He moved through facilities as classifications changed, sometimes for medical needs, sometimes because of security concerns, sometimes after disciplinary disputes over rules he didn't adjust to easily. Each transfer meant new routines, new faces, new risks. He aged in that system the way men do when the rush of daily decisions is replaced by waiting. The man who had once monitored faces at every doorway now had to accept doors opening and closing on a schedule he couldn't influence. The money side of the verdict turned into a separate grind. Agents cataloged cash seized in Santa Monica and assets linked to years of rackets. Courts ordered restitution to families and victims of extortion. Those processes take time. They also signal something more than numbers. A formal recognition that profits pulled from fear should be repurposed, however imperfectly, toward repair. His case also reshaped policy. The Bureau rewrote its rules for handling confidential sources, tightening oversight and documentation. Training shifted to emphasize that no result justifies shielding crimes beyond the law. Judges across the country cited the Boston experience when demanding transparency about informant relationships. The scandal became a caution taught in classrooms and academies. If you bend the rules for long enough, the rules will eventually break you. He had become, in the end, a complicated symbol. To some, he was the ruthless operator who finally faced justice. To others, he remained the Southie kid who refused to bow, even when institutions failed him, an argument he held close, despite the jury's verdict. To the families who spoke at sentencing, he was a man whose choices had taken from them what could never be returned. Those views don't reconcile. They sit next to each other in the public mind, unresolved, and likely to remain so. He filled his days with small routines, reading, letters, exercise when health allowed. He paid attention to sports scores and Boston gossip printed in short items in the back of papers. He remembered old streets and kept those memories to himself. He maintained the habit of scanning a room, even when there was nowhere to go and nothing to plan. Habits survive long after the conditions that created them disappear. From a boy in the projects to a man who treated information as currency, to a fugitive who blended into a quiet beach town, to a prisoner counting days, his life traced a line through an American city's rough edge and into national headlines. The trial had settled the state's claims against him. It had not settled the questions people ask when they weigh order against freedom, or when they revisit an era where too many people looked away at the wrong moments. He had built power by cultivating silence. Courtrooms replaced that silence with sworn words. Years after the verdict, his name would still spark arguments across kitchen tables and on sidewalks in neighborhoods that had long since changed. Some storefronts were new. Old bars had closed. Young people moved in who knew him only through films and footnotes. Longtime residents remembered stares, favors, envelopes, and warnings. The city moved on, as cities do, but kept a file in the back of its mind. That file listed names not to be forgotten. Prison life shrank his world to a set of lights, locks, and times posted on a bulletin board. He adjusted the way he always had by building small routines inside larger ones he could not control. He rose early, read newspapers from the first to the last page, and saved clippings when a story touched Boston or brushed his name. He wrote steady, unsentimental letters to a handful of people. Some notes went to old friends, others went to strangers who had mailed him questions out of curiosity. He told more than one young correspondent not to idolize crime. He said the life looks bold from a distance and dull up close, and that it ends one of two ways, neither of them worth a toast. He kept his voice level even on paper. He would not give anyone the thrill of confession. He maintained the line he had held for years. He did not see himself as an informant, and never would. The court fight didn't stop at the verdict. Appeals traveled the scheduled path briefs, oral argument, decisions. His team pushed the immunity claim again, challenged rulings about evidence, and argued that the government's history of leaks and favoritism poisoned the case. The appellate judges took a hard look and left the conviction in place. The result didn't surprise anyone who had followed the record. The trial had been built from multiple sources: cooperating witnesses, business records, bank box logs, tax returns that did not match any real job, and testimony from people who had once sat at his tables and now faced jurors. The judgment stood. Money questions continued in a different lane. The government cataloged cash seized in Santa Monica, traced assets, and pursued forfeitures. Restitution orders flowed to families and business owners, numbers that could not measure loss, but signaled that profits taken in fear should be redirected to repair. Civil cases moved on their own calendars. Some families sued the government for enabling harm through mishandled informant policies. Courts weighed those claims in careful opinions that recognized the damage done by compromised practices, while also parsing doctrines that shield agencies from suits. Some actions ended in settlements or judgments. Others were dismissed. Appeals followed. The litigation became part of the city's reckoning with its past. He aged into the federal system. He had heart problems and nagging pain in places that once felt bulletproof. The man who had run stairs in Southie walked corridors at measured speed. He still scanned rooms, counted faces, and kept his back to walls when possible. Old habits that gave him a sense of control in a place that allows very little. He ate what was served, took medication when it was offered, and grumbled when staff rushed him. Disciplinary write-ups came when he pushed lines. None of it changed the essential fact of his days. He woke and slept at posted times, moved when told, and played out the routines that define a long sentence. He wrote to authors who asked for comment, sometimes answering questions with clipped phrases, sometimes offering longer notes about his view of the record. In letters later quoted in books, he remained adamant that he had bought protection, not given cooperation, that corrupt agents had used him and then turned on him, and that the men who testified against him did so to save themselves. He had no interest in public redemption. He wanted control over his narrative. He thought he could out-argue the files as easily as he once outmaneuvered street rivals. Readers saw something else. A man who could not abandon the idea that he alone set the terms of his life. Outside, Boston kept changing. Old bars closed. New restaurants filled corners that once had payphones and lookouts. Triple-deckers that had housed longshoremen and welders sold to software engineers. Young residents knew his name from movies and streaming series more than from whispered warnings at closing time. Reporters wrote anniversary pieces on big cases. Investigators who had spent their careers chasing him retired, some satisfied that the verdict had landed, others still angry at how long it took. The neighborhood kept its memory in layers, some proud of the old days, others relieved they were over, many carrying a mixture that could change with the weather. Catherine Gregg followed her own calendar through the system. She served the time imposed for harboring him and for refusing to testify later. After years in custody, she transitioned to supervision outside prison, living quietly and avoiding the spotlight she had never wanted. People who had known her in California remembered a neighbor who minded her business and doted on pets. Her role in his flight was never in doubt. Neither was her loyalty. She returned to a life that had to be rebuilt from scratch. His relationship with his brother, once the most complicated public thread in the story, faded into silence. Billy Bulger had long ago stepped down from public office and from the university post that had made him a symbol of Boston's political class. He had insisted on family loyalty even when it cost him, and he had also insisted he played no part in criminal acts. That line between blood and law remained for others to debate. The brothers, who had once shared a bedroom in a public housing project, now lived in opposite worlds separated by razor wire and headlines. Neither world allowed much space for sentiment. Transfers are part of federal time. He moved through a series of facilities as classification decisions changed or as discipline required. Each stop meant new guards, new schedules, and a different mix of inmates. He learned the specific etiquette of each place. In some units, quiet ruled. In others, noise did. He kept the posture that had served him polite to staff, distant with most inmates, friendly enough to avoid friction, quick to withdraw when conversations drifted toward old stories. He could not escape notoriety. His face had been on screens nationwide. So he kept to routines that made him predictable and uninteresting day to day. Then came the transfer that would end his story. In the fall of 2018, he was moved to a high-security penitentiary in West Virginia that had a rough reputation and a staffing problem that had drawn scrutiny. He arrived late in October. Within hours, he was placed into the general population. The next morning, he was found dead. The killing was fast and brutal, without requiring lurid description. Officials notified his family. News alerts hit phones across the country. The man who had eluded arrest for 16 years and challenged a city's memory in court had died at 89, far from the harbor that shaped him. The reaction was immediate and layered. Some families of victims expressed relief that a life defined by harm ended without ceremony. Others wished he had lived long enough to see more days behind bars. Former neighbors remembered small kindnesses and went quiet when asked to weigh them against everything else. Commentators returned to the old debate about the FBI's informant strategy and the unintended consequences that had flowed from it. Lawmakers asked the Bureau of Prisons how such an obvious target had been placed among men who might want to settle scores. Editorials called for answers about staffing, transfers, and accountability. Investigators looked inward and outward. Inside the prison, they interviewed staff, reviewed logs, and checked cameras and keys. Outside, federal agents tracked movements and communications that might point to a plan. In 2022, prosecutors charged 3 men, 2 inmates with long histories in organized crime, and another who had shared a cell with offenses tied to the killing, including conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Court documents described roles: who acted, who assisted, who watched doors. Those cases moved through the system with the same slow pace that defines complex matters, with hearings, motions, and status conferences. The public learned pieces, not a full narrative. The process takes time. His estate filed its own suit, arguing that prison officials had failed to protect a high-profile inmate when basic caution should have stopped the transfer, or at least kept him out of harm's way. A judge later dismissed the case against the government under doctrines that limit liability for discretionary decisions. Appeals followed, and some claims were reworked to target individual officials. The litigation underscored the larger question raised by his death. What obligations does the state carry when it takes custody of someone, even someone with a notorious record? Policy doesn't hinge on the popularity of the prisoner. It hinges on duty. The end of his life altered none of the earlier facts. The racketeering verdict stood. The history of favoritism within a federal office still served as a cautionary tale for agents nationwide. The catalog of victims remained. Their families had spoken in court and returned to lives forever changed. Books kept appearing, each offering a new angle: a detective's log of missteps and breakthroughs, a prosecutor's view of building a case from fragments, a reporter's chronicle of a city's long conversation with its own shadow. Films and series recycled scenes with actors, amplifying elements that audiences recognize, smoothing others that don't play well on a screen. He spent his final years writing the same lines he had been saying since the day he learned to use leverage. He cast himself as the neighborhood loyalist betrayed by officials who wanted results without owning the cost. People who loved him held to that version. People who hated him found it empty. Most understood that both things were true at once. A broken system helped him, and he still chose the path he took. The myth of the protector, who kept streets safe by scaring worse men into quiet, dissolved in courtrooms. The bill for that quiet had been paid by families who were never asked and never compensated until years later. The city learned hard lessons. Law enforcement changed how it handles confidential sources, requiring layers of oversight that make lone wolf arrangements unlikely. Prosecutors speak more openly about the risks of cutting deals with violent offenders. Judges push for transparency when informants play central roles. Training academies teach the Boston years as a case study in the difference between strategy and temptation. Sometimes, when the stakes are high, the shortest path to a result looks like the best one. Those years proved the opposite. For people in South Boston who had stood inside his world, the memories stayed complicated. Some remembered envelopes passed to help with medical bills or tuition, the kind of transactional generosity that buys quiet. Others remembered a visit that changed the way a business was run without any paperwork pointing to the reason. Younger residents, who arrived long after the old lines were drawn, learned the names and the stories as part of the city's lore. They jogged along the waterfront and looked at new buildings where older ones had stood, never feeling the tension that once electrified those blocks at closing time. He had chased control from the day he learned he could take it. Prison takes that away by design. In those final years, he managed what he could. The order of his cell, the pacing of his walks, the angle of his chair during reading hours. He held his back straight in medical lines, answered questions without offering more, and listened to the faint echoes of a city he still considered his. He had been the boy from the projects with a chip on his shoulder, the enforcer who turned himself into a power broker, the source who insisted he wasn't one, the fugitive who became a tenant who fed cats, the defendant who stared down a jury, and the inmate who watched the clock instead of the street. Nothing about the end was cinematic. That is often the way with lives that loom large in rumor and small in fact. He had picked a path that required allies he could not fully trust and enemies he could never fully escape. He built a fortune in cash and favors, and then spent the last years counting minutes. He learned that the calm he had once sold to a neighborhood came at a price that never stopped coming due. In the end, the questions he had left behind mattered more than the answers he liked to give. The people who set down flowers at graves didn't need a final headline to define him. Their verdict had come long before. Judges wrote opinions that would be cited in classrooms. Agents trained on new rules for managing sources. Young prosecutors learned to build cases that didn't lean on shortcuts. If there was any legacy beyond the pain he caused, it lived in those reforms and in the vigilance born from a hard era. He never believed he would be ordinary. That belief drove him across decades and through a landscape of favors, fear, and leverage. The man who once controlled rooms with a nod left the world in a place where his name meant less than the procedures violated by those who should have known better and the families who waited longer than they should have. The story moved from corners and alleys to archives and casebooks. The city kept what it needed and let the rest go. By the time the headlines moved on, the long threads of his life were still being pulled. Reporters and authors kept tracing the small choices that, over decades, had added up to a structure built on leverage. Old neighbors remembered the boy who ran errands for older kids, the teenager who seemed to prefer corners to classrooms, the young man who found an early home in back rooms where cigarettes, cards, and whispered business set the rules. His father had been a union laborer who lost much of the use of an arm in an accident. His mother kept the family steady in a housing project where working families measured progress in pay stubs and school reports. That backdrop mattered. It taught him two early lessons. Institutions can fail you, and neighborhoods can save you. He took those lessons into adulthood and turned them into a method. He tried the Air Force and learned the language of hierarchy, got in trouble for flare-ups, and walked away with an honorable discharge, and a sense that rules are not walls, they're furniture fixed in place but usable, if you know how to lean on them. Bank jobs followed, then years in federal prisons Atlanta, Leavenworth, Alcatraz, where he watched how strong men survive by controlling their impulses and how quiet can be the sharpest blade in a room. He volunteered for psychiatric drug trials in Atlanta, hoping to earn credits that might reduce time. Decades later, he would write bitterly about the effects of those sessions, convinced they had left marks on his mind. Whether they did or not, they hardened his belief that powerful systems don't always have your interests at heart. Back in Boston, he stacked those lessons on top of a talent for reading people. In the feud between neighborhood crews, he chose patience over noise. When the Winter Hill leadership collapsed under a race-fixing case built around testimony from an insider, he stepped into the vacuum with a partner who shared his calm demeanor. He preferred tidy suits and short visits. He made himself the man who could fix a problem without making a scene. He taxed bookmakers and card rooms, steered loan customers into schedules they couldn't escape, and took his cut from narcotics, traffic, while telling neighbors he hated drugs. He built a reputation as a guardian of South Boston, while treating South Boston as the revenue base of a private company. He also built a second channel that changed everything around him. A boy from the same streets had joined the bureau and risen fast. That agent and a supervising official embraced a strategy. Flip insiders in the Italian organization, capture conversations on tape, and cut the head off a rival empire. He joined that plan on his terms, and insisted to the end that he had never been anyone's source. He saw himself as a buyer of protection. Whatever label he preferred, the result was the same. He received warnings that saved him, and used that safety to grow his reach. He played both sides, feeding select information about one group while collecting envelopes from another. It worked until it poisoned the well. Personal life rarely made headlines in those years, but it shadowed his choices. He fell for a woman from the South Shore, Lindsay Sear, and they had a son, a boy with his father's name in the middle. The child died of a sudden illness in 1973. People close to him said a part of him froze then and never thawed. He returned to work with even tighter control, and even harsher view of those he called traitors. He had other long relationships, Teresa Stanley for many years, then Catherine Gregg. He kept romance in a separate room from business, but let loyalty run through both. It's not a contradiction to say he could be generous to someone he cared about and ruthless toward a person whose usefulness had ended. That duality sat at the center of his life. He anchored his public presence at a little bar that became a clubhouse. Deals were floated there, introductions made, rules set. He preferred to keep eating and drinking low-key, a booth in the corner, a back door if he needed it, a short list of places where staff knew to keep their eyes open and their mouths closed. He liked to pay for a round when it helped. He expected favors done on time. The circle around him was small by design, Stephen Flemmy as the oldest partner, Kevin Weeks as a younger hand who could move quietly, John Martirano as the man who stepped in when the temperature rose. There were others for specialized tasks. The common thread was the same: loyalty, speed, silence. The business had outward-facing pieces that looked lawful: leases, sales, property deeds. A South Boston package store became the best-known example. A liquor business transferred under pressure in the mid-1980 seconds. Its original owner said later, he had been forced to sell at a price that robbed his family. He never made it to the witness stand. He died years later after accepting a drink from a man unconnected to the South Boston crew. Prosecutors proved that killing in a separate case. The store episode remained a symbol of how a signature on a deed can mask what happened in the room before the pen touched paper. Florida widened the stage. The cash flows around a sport few understood drew attention from people who did. Jai Alai was a niche with serious money attached. When Roger Wheeler, a wealthy businessman who had bought into the operation, began to pull threads, he tugged on the wrong fabric. He was killed in Tulsa in 1981. Investigators followed the wires and traveled the lanes between Boston, Oklahoma, and Miami. John Callahan, an executive with valuable knowledge, died in South Florida soon after. Years later, cooperating witnesses tied those events to decisions made in Boston rooms. Those cases would become pillars in the racketeering counts brought in federal court. Boston's weathered industrial neighborhoods bred a way of talking that never used more words than necessary. He took that into every interaction. He avoided telephones when he could, and treated phone calls like exams when he couldn't, as if each word might be graded later. He didn't write what he could memorize. He took long walks where he might pass the person he needed to see without anyone realizing contact had been made. He considered the shortest sentence the safest. If he trusted you, he might say 3 words where 2 would do. That was a show of warmth in his world. The rupture with law enforcement broke wide open in the 1,990 seconds. A federal judge held hearings that exposed a nest of compromises: warnings, friendly tips, cash in envelopes, dinners that never should have been bought, and a culture that saw results as the measure of everything worth doing. It turned out that the war against one group had blinded some in authority to what they were enabling in another. The judge's opinion forced reforms that rippled far beyond Boston. It made clear that a badge without restraint can become a license for the wrong people to prosper. He vanished before agents could serve the big case. A tip reached him. He slipped out with almost no trace. When his first companion on the run, Teresa, missed home too much, he took her back quietly and continued with Catherine. California provided the closest thing to invisibility that a known face could find. A city where tenants come and go without neighbors, asking questions that reach deeper than first names. He used a simple alias that sounded like a name on an old mailbox. He walked daily, fed strays behind the building, carried bags up the stairs for older tenants, and clipped stories about Boston from newspapers at the public library. The man whose choices had reshaped a neighborhood made himself ordinary by talent and will. The arrest in 2011 ended the chapter that started in 1994. The trick that brought him in was almost elegant in its simplicity. Stop aiming at the legend and focus on the routines of the woman who shared his kitchen. Salon chairs, dental visits, perfectly normal services that leave a sharper impression than most people realize. A tip from someone who recognized her set the plan in motion. He surrendered without a brawl. The apartment revealed the tools of a long flight. Money tucked behind walls, fake IDs, weapons kept for insurance. Agents logged everything. The trial would follow 2 summers later. He expected to use the courtroom as a stage for his version of the story. A man who fed investigators leads to protect his home from a mafia that had treated Boston as a branch office. The law offered him no such stage. The jury heard a record that stretched across decades and defied easy redemption scripts. Witnesses who had once been his allies described the work as it looked from inside. Envelopes collected, threats calibrated, lives lost when they became inconvenient. The verdict fit that record. The sentence turned his energy inward. His words from that point forward traveled in envelopes and sat in file drawers. He wrote often in the last years and stumbled into a strange, late public role. A cautionary voice with no interest in heroics. When young people wrote for school projects, he warned them off the fantasy. He told them the life is mostly waiting, counting, checking your back, practicing habits that eat your sleep and steal your days. He said the movies lie. He didn't beg for sympathy. He didn't apologize. He performed in his way the same speech he gave himself for decades. Control what you can. Never trust what you can't. The end arrived in a way that revealed gaps in the system that had replaced the streets as his landscape. A late October transfer placed him at a West Virginia penitentiary, known for hard edges. Within hours, he was in general population. By morning, he was gone. Investigators later accused 2 inmates with deep ties to organized crime, plus a third man who had shared a cell, of conspiring to kill him. Charges filed years after the attack described roles, timelines, and movements. Those cases will take their own path. A civil suit by his estate argued that officials had failed a basic duty of care. Courts dismissed the government as a defendant under laws that protect discretionary choices. Attempts to pursue individual officials continued. The questions, even when legal avenues close them, remain in the public's mind. The story didn't end there because stories like his never do. They keep breathing in the lives of people who stayed behind. Families who had spoken at sentencing carried on, their grief durable and private, their public appearances rare and steady. Some filed claims and saw awards. Others declined to participate in any process that asked them to put a number on loss. The South Boston, where they had grown up, kept changing. Triple-deckers painted bright colors, new restaurants, fresh money, young professionals pushing strollers past corners where lookouts once shifted their weight from one foot to the other. The code that had ruled those blocks, never talk to cops, keep business in the family, lost ground as new people asked new questions. Catherine finished her sentence and moved into supervised life outside custody. She had paid her price. The attention that found her after the arrest faded, and she returned to the quiet she'd helped build in Santa Monica. She stayed out of sight. She said nothing in public. People who had known her only as a neighbor in California, the woman who adored pets and looked after a building's small troubles, would have struggled to match that picture with the one in court filings. Both were real, which is why stories from that era rarely flatten neatly the way simple tales hope to. The culture kept processing. A book by two Boston reporters mapped the relationship between crime and case agents and gave the city a way to talk about what had happened. A documentary built around the trial let him deliver his version of events directly to the camera. A movie cast a famous actor in pale hair and cold eyes and recreated the old bars and streets with careful light. Another film, fictional but familiar, turned the premise of a gangster shielded by a compromised agent into an Academy Award night. People argued about what art gets right and wrong. Those arguments never settle anything. They serve another purpose. They keep memory alive. He disliked myth-making, except when it served him. He had spent years benefiting from the idea that he kept heroin away from South Boston and protected families from worse men. Records turned that myth on its side. He taxed dealers he could manage and punished others who caused heat. He accepted money from anything that produced it, then criticized the thing itself to neighbors. He held order in place by rewarding discretion and punishing disobedience. He wasn't alone in that practice. He was better at it than most. The list of people who paid the price for that order will always be longer than any story can tell without turning into a ledger. Court records named some and hinted at others. A full accounting exists in testimony, in stipulations, in quiet settlements, in maps with marks the public will never see. That's how this kind of story goes. You catch enough to reveal the pattern, you rarely catch everything. If there is a single thread that runs through every chapter, it is the belief that information is the true currency of power. He traded in it with the Bureau. He hoarded it in South Boston. He protected it on the run. He managed it in letters. Information let him move before others did. It also became the archive that proved what prosecutors needed to prove. Paper trails, human memory, small records from banks and clerks' offices, and the narrowest of notes scribbled by investigators who refused to give up, turned information into the instrument that finally caught him. People still ask what the lesson is. There isn't just one. A city learned how fragile trust becomes when the people tasked with enforcing laws decide that short-term gains justify long-term damage. Agencies changed how they handle confidential sources, adding layers of oversight that make it harder for one agent and one source to build a private world. Neighborhoods learned that peace built on fear is not peace. Families learned, again, that justice can arrive decades late and still matter. He would have disliked the idea that he taught anything to anyone. He believed he had outsmarted his time and his town, and would have died on his own schedule if not for a bad administrative decision. He held to that stance even when the record sent another message. He had lived a life made from choices that sent ripples through a city. He had forced institutions to confront their own weaknesses. He had inspired both silence and speeches. He had left behind more questions than his letters could answer. What remains are streets that don't look the way they used to, a skyline that has moved, a harbor that keeps breathing the same slow rhythm it always has, and a story people return to when they talk about Boston's hard decades. It is a story about a boy who found a way to make himself matter in rooms most people never enter, about a man who used neighbors and agents to build something that looked like order, about the cost of that order when you finally count it. It is not a legend worth celebrating. It is a record worth remembering, so that the next time a shortcut promises a clean victory, people who know this story can say, not again. Cities keep their memories in layers. One layer remembers the smell of the harbor after rain, the clang of shipyards, and boys racing each other down project stairwells two at a time. Another layer hears the hush of late-night bars where a nod can change a week. A third layer belongs to files and transcripts, to names read aloud under oath in rooms where nobody smokes and nothing moves unless the clerk says so. His story runs across all of those layers. You can follow it from a kitchen in Old Harbor Village to an Air Force base, to a bank lobby, to a cell block, to a quiet apartment near the Pacific, and back again to a courtroom where strangers decided what the record meant. The first choices were small. A skipped class, a corner claimed, a dare accepted because pride is a stubborn teacher. The next choices were larger. Bank jobs that turned a kid's courage into a federal case file. Prison years that taught him patience and control. A return to South Boston timed to a neighborhood feud begging for a tactician. He adopted a measured tone and a neat look, treated gossip as a tool, and let people think he hated chaos more than anything. That part was even true. He liked order. He just wanted to be the one who set its price. What set him apart wasn't charisma alone or a talent for menace. It was information management. He learned early that knowledge beats noise. Who owes money? Which precinct captain resents which supervisor? Where a rival parks? When a bookmaker makes collections? Which headlines will distract which office? Which agent wants a big case enough to trade lines most people won't cross? He built a business around that edge. Bookmaking fell into line. Loans rolled over forever. Bars and card rooms paid for permission to operate without surprise. Dealers were taxed in the shadows while residents heard loud speeches about keeping drugs away from kids. A liquor business changed hands during a South Boston afternoon and became a symbol for paperwork that hides pressure. He also built a second revenue stream that never showed up on ledgers: access to federal ears. A neighborhood connection turned into a pipeline. Tips about rival operations bought him warning after warning. Some of those tips helped agents nail wiretap cases that brought down older organizations across the city, a clear win for the Bureau and a clear windfall for him. The arrangement looked clever in the moment and catastrophic in hindsight. It insulated him, betrayed the public trust, and seeded a scandal that would haunt careers, stain cases, and force national reforms. The darkest parts of his record live in names that families know by heart. A Tulsa businessman who asked hard questions about missing money. A former executive in Miami whose knowledge made him dangerous to people who feared discovery. A South Boston man who approached authorities and the friend who gave him a ride home. A suspected informant after a broken arm shipment. A bank robber lured into a trap over a dispute about cash. Two young women linked to his closest ally who didn't live to tell their side. Others, less known outside certain circles, weighed just as heavily on the people who loved them. A jury decades later found sufficient proof for some of those killings and insufficient proof for others. The pattern the government described, an enterprise that sustained itself through intimidation and violence, carried the day. For years he thrived as Boston's old hierarchies crumbled. He stepped into the space left by a race-fixing case that toppled earlier leadership. He kept a small crew tight and trained. He demanded silence the way a corporation demands non-disclosure, with enforcement that people didn't need spelled out. He maintained a public code, helped neighbors keep streets calm that softened his image, and made some residents feel protected, even as the revenue machine collected from almost anything that produced cash. That paradox is why the story still sparks arguments. Some remember gestures, others remember threats, many remember both. The collapse began where it always does, with time, pressure, and someone talking. Former allies chose cooperation. A judge pulled back the curtain on a compromised era in the Boston FBI office, and the shock traveled far beyond the city. The old logic let a source operate if it means convicting bigger fish looked like a mirage once the full price was counted. He got a whispered warning about an indictment and vanished. 16 years later, a media campaign aimed at the woman who shared his life cracked the case. A neighbor recognized habits, not a face. He surrendered without spectacle. Cash, IDs, and weapons sat where he could reach them, proof of how seriously he treated survival. The trial didn't ask jurors to admire or condemn street efficiency. It asked them to decide whether a structure existed and whether he ran it. Witnesses from his inner circle described routines, collections, meetings, messages delivered in kitchens and cars, decisions framed as solutions to problems that somehow always yielded profit for the house. Records backed them up. The verdict: racketeering, extortion, money laundering, firearms crimes, participation in multiple murders, sent him to a life measured in counts and chow lines. He refused to concede the label that bothered him most. He said he had purchased protection, not given cooperation. It was a distinction without legal difference. Prison turned his world into schedules. He read, wrote, and scolded starry-eyed students who mailed him questions, telling them the life they imagined is all waiting and watching and raising your guard until it devours you. He didn't apologize to families when he wrote in public. He didn't forgive the agents he blamed for betrayal. He insisted, to the end, that the system had wronged him worse than he had wronged others. Letters from those years read like a closing argument he could never quite finish. They revealed a man who never lost his faith in control even after control left him. Then the system failed him in a different way. A late October move put an elderly, high-profile inmate with many enemies into a rough penitentiary. Within hours, he was in general population. By morning, he was dead. Investigators later charged 3 men with offenses tied to the attack, 2 with long histories in organized crime, and a third who had shared a cell. Those cases moved at the slow pace of complex prosecutions. His estate sued over the transfer, arguing that officials had ignored basic duty. Courts dismissed the government under rules that protect discretionary decisions. Filings against individuals continued. The questions didn't fade. How did a man that notorious end up exposed like that? While legal pieces kept moving, the wider reckoning settled in. Families spoke at sentencing, and then returned to lives that had to be rebuilt around permanent absence. Some received restitution ordered by courts. Others wanted nothing to do with numbers. They watched another autumn come to South Boston, another winter set in, another spring tug at the harbor. The neighborhood kept changing. New apartments rose where cinderblock shops had stood. Young professionals walked strollers past corners where lookouts once leaned, and the arguments that once filled back rooms migrated to bookshelves, comment sections, and film festivals. Art kept bending the facts into stories. Reporters laid out timelines in clean prose. A blockbuster crime film borrowed the premise of a gangster protected by a compromised agent and sent it to the Oscars. A later movie offered a cold portrait with movie stars playing barroom ghosts. Documentaries returned to the trial and gave him a last, clipped word on camera. People watched, argued, learned a little, forgot a little, learned again. Myths shed pieces as documents accumulated, and what remained was harder, plainer. He did not create order, he monetized fear. The policy lessons endure. Agencies rewritten their informant rules, adding layers of review, documentation, and oversight that make private alliances between a case agent and a powerful source far less likely. Prosecutors learn to balance tactical wins against strategic risks. Judges ask sharper questions when confidential sources sit at the center of a case. Police academies study the Boston years as a cautionary tale. If you excuse harm to catch harm, you can end up sponsoring the very problem you swore to end. Those reforms aren't perfect. They are better than what came before. People sometimes ask whether South Boston was safer under him. The question betrays a wish for simple answers. Streets felt quieter at times because those most likely to cause noise were taxed or pushed out. That calm had a cost measured in envelopes, in stolen businesses, in voices held down, in chairs that stayed empty at dinner forever. The record from courtrooms, memoirs, and investigative series fills in gaps that neighborhood nostalgia leaves out. Peace built on intimidation is not peace. It's a pause that lasts only as long as the person charging rent can keep the lights on. He treated loyalty as a contract with penalties and used kindness as a tool for influence. He saw rules as furniture to be leaned on, not walls to be respected. He believed he owned his narrative. The verdict said otherwise. The city he haunted grew up, rotated leadership, absorbed new people, built new industries, and kept the old stories in archives and oral histories. Kids in South Boston today learn his name the way students learn chapter headings. A unit about an era when a neighborhood and a federal office lost their bearings at the same time. What remains for anyone trying to understand him is a ledger in 2 columns. On one side sits the method, the bank jobs, the prison schooling, the crew building, the information deals, the envelopes, the calculated denials, the fugitive years bought with cash and caution, the trial posture that never budged. On the other side sits the price. Families who spoke under oath about rooms that never felt the same again. Business owners who learned that a signature can be forced without a word. Public trust, bent until it cracked. And a civic lesson that will be taught for as long as people study how institutions fail. He would have preferred a different ending, one where he decides when to leave the stage. He didn't get that. Very few do. The city wrote the last paragraph without him, as cities always do. There's no romance in the closing scene. An older man under fluorescent lights, a transfer, a door, a mistake, a headline, an investigation, a file stamped and filed away. The harbor keeps breathing. The streets keep moving. People still argue over coffee about what really happened and what it meant. That argument is healthy. It means the story didn't own them. They own the story now. Walk through South Boston on a clear morning, and you'll see what replaces legends. Workers in hard hats, runners on the waterfront, kids heading to school with backpacks bright enough to catch the Sunday. A few storefronts hold names that remember the old days. Most don't. The past isn't gone. It's just layered beneath a present that goes about its business without asking permission from ghosts. Somewhere, a file cabinet holds a folder with his name on it. Inside are dates, exhibits, transcripts, order after order. That folder is heavy because the story was heavy. It's also finite. It ends. For anyone hearing this at night, under a quiet roof, the lesson is simple and not dramatic. Power built on fear feels strong, until daylight asks who paid for it. Systems can drift when results become a creed. Neighborhood loyalty can be used to excuse harm. Yet city life, for all its detours and scandals, bends back toward accountability. People keep records. Judges hold hearings. Families refuse to forget. The boy from the projects learned to use silence as a weapon. In the end, sworn words cut through it. The streets that taught him cunning outlasted his legend. And the city that once looked away finally looked straight at the story and wrote it down. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Whitey Bulger here, thanking you for stepping into the shadows of Boston's history with me. If this story helped you drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories travel. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of the past carry you gently into sleep. Good night.